On today's episode, we're going to be discussing sewing techniques. We'll get techniques with our friend Wig-Wig Cosplay. I'm Rob Swaghammer, and this is Nick Tomorrow. Hey folks, it's Rob. Off to my right is, of course, Kirsten, aka Tacocat. And today we actually have SkyPirate, or Janelle, from Wig-Wig Cosplay. How you been doing?
Pretty good. Just doing a self-induced quarantine to make sure that everything is okay for itty-bitty little Thanksgiving gathering that we're having. So everyone is on lockdown, so we'll all be safe as possible.
Yeah, I know. I mean, let's face it, this has been a weird fucking timeline. And no, Louise, I did not have an aneurysm. I just misspoke, okay? Sorry. So, today we're going to be talking about sewing techniques. And even though, Janelle, you were actually on our World Without Con stream, but actually part of the reason why we wanted you on that, and actually very specifically on this, was because you and your husband have actually done quite a bit of cosplay judging, for one. And also, you were the representatives for the United States for the International Cosplay League Championships in 2019, which you actually won.
We did.
You brought home the gold.
Yes,
right?
You brought home the gold.
First time for the U.S. too.
So that was one of the big reasons why we definitely wanted to have you on here, especially because sewing is kind of like your main contribution on this, for your half of the group there. So, and Kirsten, this is a subject you and I have been talking about for a while as far as how to do it. And then once you two started actually talking and just got the list, it just kind of went. And, normally we do Sunday streams, but we're like, hey, let's do, Friday night. Why not? So there's one thing I want to ask about first for the two of you. So prior to getting into cosplay, what was your experiences with sewing? Flip a coin for whoever wants to go first. So,
Mine's really fast.
Okay, go ahead then.
I had to sew from my mom and grandma, and that was pretty much it. I took a home ec course in middle school.
Okay.
We sewed a bag and we sewed a pillowcase, and that was about that. So pretty much everything that I know is self-taught.
Okay, wow, okay. And Kirsten, what about you?
So I started to learn how to sew my senior year of high school in a sewing class.
Mm-hmm.
And we did a napkin, and somewhere I have my janky little napkin. That's the first thing I made. A pillowcase. We did a pillow cover with some hand embroidery on it. And a little foldy purse. And I think that was all of the projects, or at least the big ones we did, and there may have been small things.
Okay.
And then other than that, I made a few pieces of clothing for Lauren, because she was like, I need a skirt that's like this, or I need an outfit, and then a few aprons.
Okay.
So a little bit of clothing, aprons, and then random things like pillows.
Okay. So it's very interesting to see the differences, as far as you're beginning to cosplay, and then just kind of how after that, just for all of you, just went nuts here.
Hey Rob.
Yeah.
You should read the chat. There's some notes for you.
Yeah, I know. I was gonna say, Luis, actually, if I need to come down on this one, and Janelle, he's actually saying if you can bring your audio up a little bit, I think that's part of it too. So. Yeah, I was going to say, unfortunately, Louise, I don't have direct control over everybody's audio because I don't have that cool of a setup. Even though I know how to do it. What's that?
You said turn us up or turn you down.
Yeah, I could probably just turn myself down, honestly, so.
Yeah, I can't really turn myself up in Zoom.
Okay, I'll just turn down my gain. And Louise, let me know if that sounds okay. So, I'm going to start off on this topic list, but it's really going to be the two of you who are going to be kind of driving it some here, because you know way more about these subjects than I do, by far. So, and this is interesting, the very first one on the list, because this was something Carson, you and I had talked about during cosplay planning, was about fabric choices. but we're going to talk, but you two, we're going to talk about more along the lines of what to consider specific to sewing. So I don't know how you two particularly want to talk about this because I don't know who wrote what actually. So.
Well, the first two were me, but I don't know if we want to start with that or what.
No, go ahead.
It's kind of like tied together.
Well, go ahead and go for it. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll just start with the first one. So generally, when you have fabric, you have the selvage edge, which that's gonna. What happened if I do have some? This edge.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't unravel. So as long as you're parallel to that edge or perpendicular, your fabric's not going to stretch. But if you're at the 45-degree angle, your fabric is going to be really stretchy. Like even if it's a cotton, it will stretch some. So there's the difference of being on grain or on the bias. And if you were, say, making, I don't know what, I don't know, just a dress out of a fabric that's cottony or whatever, if you cut it on the bias, it's going to stretch some way, depending on however you have that. So if you do it on the grain, it will be like a diagonal stretch. But if you had it rotated weird, it could stretch up, down, or around you, and it's going to warp when you sew, especially if the pieces are inconsistently placed on the fabric.
Okay.
So that can cause issues, or like if you don't want your neckline drapey, but now it's looking drapey because of how you had it oriented on fabric. Which drape is something Wig-Wig wants to talk about.
Yeah. So going off of that, you might find out after you've cut your pieces and you've let them set or you've worked on your project for a while and then you realize, it's not quite sitting the way it used to. It's kind of gotten a little bit loose almost. That's the fabric kind of settling.
Or like
thing on the bias.
Are a great example of it.
Yes.
So you can cut a circle
bias,
skirt.
It'll you need to let it set because what'll happen is basically the stress of the piece from being cut off of the rest of the piece is going to start kind of shifting the weave around. So the piece needs to kind of regather itself in a way and kind of compose itself again. So that will cause the fabric to either lengthen or spread apart. So you'll have to be careful about that on things like necklines and specifically what Kirsten was saying with circle skirts. So.
Yeah, because I've cut off sometimes up to 3 inches off of something to get it back to the length I wanted it to be. So circle skirts is it's a very obvious example because you need to let this hang down before you hem it. Otherwise your hem will be a wavy mess.
Yes. Yeah, completely uneven. So you let that really just kind of hang. I usually let it hang overnight. If not, it'll be the evening to the next evening. So a kind of a 24-hour period almost is usually I let my fabric drape.
Okay.
I'll let it go longer the heavier the fabric is though, because just like anything, it needs lighter fabric isn't going to take as long because there isn't as much weight there to pull it down. But if you're working with a heavier fabric, you need to make sure that you're letting all of the weight settle. So you don't let it set for a while and then you make your hem and then it settles the rest of the way, the last 25%, and suddenly your hem is all ugly and you're like, what happened? I let it set. Well, it's not. So.
But then there's other times where you want to take advantage of the bias in a fabric. Maybe you're actually making a bias tape or you do want a slight bit of stretch, but you'll have to make sure you pattern and if it's a neck, like we said, you don't want this to look wavy when it's on you because it stretches weirdly. You have to test it to figure out if that stretch works with the application you're trying to do.
I was gonna say, so there was actually one thing, and like I said, because this is, you know more about the subject, but I didn't quite catch this particular piece here because there was a thing in here about how to fix fabric if it's off the grain.
Yeah, I actually made a little sample of this. So one way to tell if your fabric is on or off, and this happens because when they wrap it around a bolt with the machine, that's stretching the weave.
Yeah.
So it screws it up. Now it was on grain and then I made it go off grain. But basically you want to snip and then tear 2 things because it should be the same length. And as you can see here, something's not right. And if I unfold it, it looks more like a trapezoid than a
Yeah.
rectangle. And so to fix that, you have to like go through and stretch the fabric the other way to kind of undo what happened to it.
Okay.
And that will help reduce some of the warping, because if you cut it like that, some pieces will have the weave one way and then another piece will be going another way.
Yeah.
And so when you sew those together, you might get weird puckers and stuff like that in your seam. Let's see.
So
that did not fix it well enough.
So now that we've got the fabric piece out of the way, we're going to go like even more so into sewing. And there was one thing, because one thing we'd want to talk about for this is that how we didn't really want it to be like a sewing 101. We wanted to like really kind of make sure to deep dive into a number of things. But there was one thing we did want to talk about beginner wise, was how could, you know, people learn. And Kirsten, you and I had talked about this, and Janelle, I'm curious if you know, your thoughts on this too, was actually using sampler kits to learn on for some of these techniques.
Oh. Sorry, I unplugged the light.
What's that?
A light came unplugged.
Oh.
There we go. Let there be light again.
A lot of sound, sir.
So no, I was talking about sampler kits.
You want to talk about sewing?
Learning things, so.
Okay.
Well, I mean, he wears things that are sewn, so maybe he has some input.
That's fair. He's just on the ground making a lot of noise.
So the sampler thing now, I know in stores you can get like small kits for whatever project, but I put this in more of like a project that you come up with that suits what you're working towards. So like I have my book of them, and it can be as simple as practicing doing a circular piece. So this corner here, it's like a quarter circle sewn to a flat piece, or sewing a corner like that. And I mean, especially if you're doing very complex patterning, those techniques are going to help you if you're doing that. And then let me actually do the pants pocket. So like what I did here was, before making a pair of jeans, I did small portions of it. So here's the pocket style that would be on a jean. It's just the pocket. Doesn't take much fabric, but I learned how to do a pocket on that before I went to the big thing.
See, you're so much more proactive. I just do it.
See, sometimes I just wing it, but if it's something I really want to come out nice, it's better to practice first.
Yeah,
Or
usually
like,
that's where my multiple
fly
mock-ups
zipper.
come in place, but at the same time, I would practice that on a whole mock-up piece rather than making colors. So
Yeah, because this was actually for a class, and that what we did before doing the big project is we did all the little steps to learn the specific technique, and then moved on to a mock-up where we did all of that, figured out how we had to make it like make changes so it fit us better, and then went on to the real deal, which I think that setup worked better instead of just diving straight into a mock-up like sometimes, because I don't know, you learn more of the technique, and then you go into, okay, now I want to take this and make it fit me, rather than I need to learn this and make it fit me all at once.
Well, I was gonna say,
So, which sometimes that can be overwhelming.
Well, I was gonna say, and to that point, because it's funny how we're kind of talking about that now with mock-ups, because that's something we're gonna go into. But one thing I was wondering about, especially with using samplers, are there, you know, and I'm speaking this, and I'm saying this, you know, given my complete lack of experience, is there anything?
thanks. I don't know what's happening. He's just measuring my head. I guess he's like making something.
Don't you have like the wig heads that like you had like this stuffed in the saran wrap like Kirsten does?
No. Actually, with that, we both have like 21-inch heads, so we're the size of a wig head. So wigs are actually kind of big on us. So
okay.
come in
You're
usually.
lucky.
So
yeah, even with all of the hair, it's thin, so it just braids up real nice.
Okay. So the thing I was going to say, with doing, you know, when you're testing sewing techniques, is there, and like I said, complete noobs, I don't know, is there anything with doing the testing versus maybe the size of the piece that you may potentially want to use that technique on, is there anything you need to consider, or is it just, you can test on a small piece and it should scale nicely on larger pieces?
So the main thing I can think of, or it's kind of related to my sewing setup with how the table is, if I have something really big, I'm going to have to like weirdly have it up on my iron, try and prevent the weight of the fabric pulling it off of my sewing machine. So, and when you're not careful about that, your stitching can be all like this instead of straight.
Okay. I say, Janelle, anything to add to that, or?
Oh, I mean, that's kind of similar to like what I do.
Okay. So, like I said, this was going to make for a great segue because we're also talking about, making patterns and doing mock-ups, and how tailoring needs to fit into that. And I know, Kirsten, you've got quite a bit on that, but actually, I want to start with Janelle on this one.
I know. She definitely has way more than I have on tailoring.
Okay.
She knows more about it.
The thing is, like, all of my tailoring is self-taught. So, like, I've read one book on tailoring, and the rest of it I figured out as I go. And like to useful resources, like other cosplayers, other sewers, and people like that, who, work in bridal or something. Like my grandma used to do alterations for bridal wear.
Okay.
So it's a lot about altering from her, specifically for items that are already made, and how to like do those. So that's kind of the second half of my alteration. But the first half I learned like pattern Frankensteining from my mom.
Yeah.
So I learned how to do a little bit of that. I avoid commercial patterns kind of like the plague because I'm not good at reading the delta. So I don't know. They use a lot of terms and they leave a lot of steps out. So I just kind of start making my own mock-ups. But the thing about it is, even though I use and make my own mock-ups, they have to fit. Because in my brain, when I'm in the judging room, to me, a pattern that is made, or I guess a piece that is made using a commercial pattern versus a piece that is made using a self-made pattern, that is king. So it doesn't matter where you started, it matters where you ended. And if we're tied, someone used a commercial and someone made their own, if they both fit immaculately, the person who made their own pattern is probably going to get a little more like point to it because they started off at a lower space than the person who used the commercial pattern because they already got the jumping block.
You didn't have the experts do the work for you beforehand.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, and have something that's well made, but isn't necessarily tailored to fit you. And like I told you earlier, this suit jacket is one of those because like the shoulders sit too far off my shoulders. And while I went through, did the hand stitching like you should on one of these, and it looks nice, but the fit is kind of off. So
I should have brought up one of Alan's suits.
Even though this has nice lining and all of that, no, because the fit is off. So
yeah, and that's kind of the bummer about it, is that you can make something super tailored and super nice, but if it doesn't fit, then your is all to waste.
Yeah, see, most of my tailoring experience comes into mock-ups, trying it on, and then being like, okay, so this seam, I need to move it over like this, or I need to take it in a little bit here so it curves better.
Yep. Yeah.
So, and I recently did get a bridal book that talks more specifically about alterations that you do for patterns on bridal stuff, so I haven't read all of it yet, but excited to.
All right. So, let's talk about types of seams here. And once again, I don't know who put in what. So
I just made a big list because friends asked that we cover it, and I was like, well, I don't know where it will fall in, but here's a list of things.
Well, I was gonna say. Well, actually, for Kirsten. Well, actually, for either one of you. So for these seams specifically, have you used all four that were in this list, or have you maybe focused more on certain ones because they fit more of what you were building, that what you're more likely to build, or what?
The only one I haven't done is the bound seam / Hong Kong finish.
Okay, that's one that I've done. I've done all of them in sewing across the ages, but in cosplay, I have not found a use for a flat felled seam nor a welt seam yet. So
Yeah, I only learned those because I'm
like
making
a
jeans.
yeah, welt seam I really haven't found any use for myself, at least in the costumes.
Mhm.
But the flat felled seam I can see myself. I can think back, and I think I've used kind of like a halfway house flat felled seam before that I just kind of like made up part of it to make it work more to what I needed it to do.
I say, Kirsten, I was gonna say, same question for you. Is there any ones you've kind of more focused on for, especially for cosplay, or?
So, the one I use most often is French seams. I love French seams. Like my Zelda, for the underskirt, because the underskirt is not lined, it has French seams on it.
Mm,
All of these sailor fukus I do, those have French seams. Generally, if it's something that I'm not lining, I will try to do a French seam if I can.
okay.
Yeah, agreed
So,
on that.
Well,
because it just helps prevent it from fraying apart at a seam.
well, I was
Even
gonna
though I
say,
get extra, and I also serge because I'm a serger like fanatic. I love my serger, and I will use it every chance I get.
well, I was gonna say, and to that point, real quick, since you mentioned stuff that wasn't lined, for stuff that is, how does that change?
So like for this layer of the skirt, because it is lined, I just went ahead and serged each edge and then did a straight stitch.
Okay.
And then the lining is done the same way because the serging will keep that fabric from fraying. And the reason why I wouldn't do a French seam on something like that would have two layers of that is it'd be too bulky, and you would
Okay.
see like the bunch of the fabric right up on the seam.
Okay.
So I prefer the sleeker, iron it flat, and just have your layers like that.
Okay. Well, I was gonna say, as part of the next section, speaking of surging, and I know how you love yours, since we're talking about finishing edges, I was gonna say, and actually, Janelle, I don't know, or actually, it's a good question for you. Is like, how much use of surging do you apply to a lot of your cosplays there?
For me, sorry, one of my screens just went bonkers. Okay, computer, behave. For me, I did not start using my serger until about 3 years into heavy competition.
Okay.
Because when I was afraid to take it out of the box for the first time
Cool.
because it was spooky to me. And then I finally did, and I wound up really liking it. So I kind of used it on basically everything at that point.
Okay.
I needlessly surge things because I also panic about my fabric unraveling a point in the very future that I'll probably never even look at these costumes. So it's unnecessary anxiety, but I still use my serger for it anyway. But yeah, no, I really enjoy using my serger, but not only for like cleaning up edges and making sure they're sealed. I am addicted to rolled hems on the serger because my sergers can make really pretty rolled hems. I have an example here of one of them, but
Okay.
it's so pretty.
Oh, there you
See,
go.
I need to
Yeah.
play more with mine to get like the perfect, the chef kiss rolled
Mhm.
hems.
Right? No, I really enjoy doing rolled hems on my machines. My giant cape for Foo, that's like 10 yards of fabric. The whole cape is all rolled hemmed, the whole thing.
That is great.
And French
Wow.
seamed because it's not lined because it's chiffon. So this is a big old cape. The whole thing, when it's bundled up, weighs about 5 pounds of fabric.
Yeah, like my Glenda petticoat, the way I did all the seams on that. So I did the gathering and I sewed them, like I actually sewed all the tiers and serged it all at once because I did the 2 needle serging. So with 2 needle, you're
Yes.
working with 4 threads. So instead of like this where it just has that loopy bit on the edge, there's also like a straight stitch that goes on to help hold it in place. So because if it's just like an edge that I'm sewing for just keeping it nice and not unraveling, I'll use 3. But if it's something like the petticoat monster, I went for 4 threads. It made more sense and saved time.
Yeah, and with 4, that's kind of like the standard overlock.
Mhm.
And then 3 is a like specialty overlock, even though really it's not. It's just missing one of the straight stitches.
Mhm.
Found that one kind of helps reduce tension on stretch fabrics because there's less vertical sewing and I guess horizontal sewing. Makes any sense. So that I found out. I really, pretty much my machine flips between being a 4-thread overlock and a rolled hem monster, so, which uses three.
I need to do more playing with rolled hems, because when I first did it with that one, because I looked online more about like that specific machine, or at least that general line, and people were like, oh yeah, I use the nylon threads and this and that, and the nylon threads are a pain in the butt.
They really are. I'm not a fan of nylon threads. I don't care for them much. I'll stick to cotton and polyester thread. It's fine.
So, but yeah, that's something I need to do more testing with. But I love my serger. It is my friend. That's why I have it next to my sewing machine.
Well, I was gonna say, I remember like one of the first times, Kirsten. Just as a quick aside, I remember one of the first times you and I had started talking before even MTA was a thing. I remember one thing you had mentioned to me was like you were about to fight your serger, and I forget what you were working on at the time. And I said just make sure to hit confirm low forward before you go into Super Art 2. 5 points for anybody who gets the reference I just made. So,
well, no, now I want to say why I fight my serger.
Yeah.
So it's an older one. It is not the self-threading kind where you like shove the threads in a little hole and hit a button and it just does it. And so you have to go through and do like the crazy mess that it is to get this properly threaded so it moves the right bits and can loop. You can do it the same way 5 times in a row and it won't work right until the last time.
Yep.
So whenever you need to rethread it or change colors, you are going to fight it.
Yes.
I'm just reminded of the joke of putting in the USB cable and you think you're putting it in the right way, but it doesn't go in, and you flip it over, it doesn't go in, and you flip it back over. And
Yeah,
it goes
it's
in.
that.
Stop calling me out.
Thank God USB-C is a
It's okay,
thing.
I do that too.
Thank God USB-C is a thing. So, you both love your sergers, that's obvious. But you have a number for finishing edges. You both put in quite a bit in here. So why don't you go ahead and talk about those? Because like I said, I don't know who has what in here. So.
Yeah, I made the list, but I primarily use serging and French seams. So, like I've done some of the pinking shears, so that's your scissors that have like the zigzag cut.
Mm-hmm.
So with how it cuts it, because it cuts it so that triangle is like the bias, it's not gonna come apart. Yeah, those guys. There's
That's
nice
not helpful.
zigzag.
There we go. Where like it's got like a little serrated edge. I wonder if I can get it. There we go.
Yeah, there you go.
Yay.
Like.
So that's one way you can help your fabric to not unravel is just cutting it over with those. Yeah, they're nice. Because I know my great grandma, because she was the one who lived with us and did a lot of sewing. She most of the time would just use pinking shears on all of the stuff she made her seams. She would just trim them that way. Occasionally she would use the serger because that actually was her serger. But most of the time she just trimmed them. Mm-hmm. So I will. There's overcasting, which is a stitch you can do on a normal sewing machine if you don't have a serger, and it basically acts like it. It just kind of loops around the fabric some to keep it together. And same thing with zigzagging, which you can kind of adjust what length you want for that zigzag, but same idea as the serger. You're just adding stitches to help hold it together.
Yeah.
I will let you tackle the bound seam.
Okay. Yeah. So talking on zigzag as kind of a alternate, or I guess like an alternative to serging. If you're gonna zigzag, also add in a straight stitch, so that way then you are like almost fully mimicking what a serger will do. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
However, if it's a stretch fabric, actually, your comment reminded me, a stretch fabric, you would probably just want to do a zigzag for your seam. Not necessarily you're worried about it unraveling, because stretch fabrics don't tend to unravel. But because it's stretchy, if you have a straight stitch, you're going to pop the stitching. Yeah. So like the sailor fugus, most of the seams on that, I use a zigzag stitch, especially the chest armor, because you want it to be able to stretch with you.
Yes.
And not pop.
So for a bound seam, a bound seam is when you create bias tape and then you put the bias tape on top of the seam. So you will essentially cover your, like, you'll iron out your seam so it's laying nice and flat, and then you'll cover up the uglies with some really nice bias tape and you'll stitch that down. It's a good way to reduce bulk. but also, I mean, you could just do a French seam in the too. So I mean, like that one's kind of an interchangeable, and I see a lot of people doing bound seams on the insides of like arm sides and around. It's a bound seam can also be kind of like fake yoking, so you can kind of do it around a neckline as well.
Okay.
In that, and then in really like creative spots too, where I'm like, wow, that's a really good use of a bound seam, and it just works.
Yeah.
Piece.
What I've seen some people do for their seams now, I don't really know why they did it, but instead of like covering the whole seam, like they did like this side with bias tape, and then the matching one would also have some of that. So you would have it like, here's our fake little seam. So each side would have like its own little bias tape strip on it instead of the whole thing covered.
I've seen that as well, and that seems to me like a lot of work.
I'm like, why? What does it do? Please tell me.
The other one I've seen where people leave their seam allowance really like wide, and then they'll curl it in. They'll basically like do like what you would call a rolled hem on a sewing machine. They'll roll it once and then tuck it again. So if you folded it so the raw edge is touching where they've sewn, if that makes any sense. They basically, so I'm gonna see if this can show up. But pretend there's an ugly raw edge over here that's like really long, and this side they've sewn it, or here, I'll just do this. So like this side, they've taken all the extra and they've like folded it over really nice and like stitched it down. And on the other side, they did the exact same thing with that seam allowance and then stitched that down. And it's just,
that's weird.
It's kind of weird to me, like, but I see where they're going, but like there are alternatives that are a lot easier.
Yeah, and I feel like depending on what you're making, that can make your seam very bulky.
Yes.
Because you'd have at least 3 layers of fabric, at least. Because you have the outer layer, that one, and then it's folded under.
Yeah, I agree. Like, if you're gonna do bound seams, I always just kind of go for like one piece of bias tape over it, because if I'm adding bias tape on, I'm already adding 2 more layers of fabric in, since I've folded the bias tape over, so raw edges are inside. Yeah, there's like a ton of different ways to do bound edges. It's wild.
Okay.
And then we already talked about rolled hems and that they're great. And that you shouldn't use nylon thread to do that because nylon thread is a pain in the butt.
I just really love rolled hems, guys.
So actually, let's move into the next section, because the rolled hems were part of it, was actually tight hems. So, like I said, great segue in there. So let's actually go ahead and talk about that. And to a point we kind of talked about with finishing edges, but I didn't know specifically if there was different ways you have to look at it versus like a hem versus anything else. So
you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I can. So the double fold, we actually, I touched on that, what I called a rolled hem. What I've learned as it's called is a rolled hem, because you're taking the fabric and you're rolling it. So you take your fabric, so say this is the uggles and you want to hide it, so you fold it over once and it's still showing, so you want to fold it over again, so now it's not showing.
Right.
So, and then you would stitch that down.
So this shows one
the edge is possible, so then it looks really nice on the other side. Yes, like that.
Woo.
Woohoo. So that one, I've heard it called a rolled hem, even though on a serger there is also a thing called a rolled hem, because congruency. But the carrots are also orange. We can't just call them by their color.
Yeah, see, I've seen this called like a folded, a double fold, a rolled, a double rolled, and I'm like, when we have one name, not like 4.
Sewing. But yeah, so that's one. That's the most common one. If I've seen people use that one if they're not lining things, and also if they are lining things, because the way that you can reduce bulk in it is if you're lining, if you are lining your piece but you still want to do a rolled hem, cut the lining a little bit shorter and roll it into that second fold so it doesn't need to fold with it every time. So you reduce the amount of fabric by 2 layers in that first fold. So, because it's just the outside.
Yeah.
But then when you sew it, you catch both of them because they're both rolled in. Haha, science. Measuring. So that's a good one. That one I'd say is the most basic of finishes, but it is the most important. It's a solid foundation. And
you
then
can use it in a whole bunch of different things.
right.
I'm gonna grab a
Done on the
foot
serger. You know, one of the most common finishings on a serger for like the pretty hems that are seen by everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like a ready to be judged hem because it is actually finished and this is the way the piece is.
Right.
I wouldn't put out a like overlocked piece because that's really like a finishing edge rather than like a finished edge.
Right.
So.
And Kirsten is apparently on the hunt for something, so.
Yes.
Some feet. So for the next one, I grabbed this because of the narrow rolled hem.
Oh yeah.
It's done because of a foot. So I don't know how
Special
well
foot for that.
it, but it basically makes the fabric do its little double fold by just running through this. However, it doesn't work equally well on all fabrics. I will say that. I've had very little success with this, and I want to make it work better.
Oh no.
But then this is another one that we actually could have mentioned earlier, but I didn't think about it till I was there. So this is actually done for sewing down bias tape, and it helps it move around the fabric, and you can adjust where it's at with this knob. I haven't used it. It came with my bias tape making kit, but yeah, so you can have a bias tape sewing foot.
There's literally feet for sewing machine for like everything. It's absurd.
Because like you have your normal zipper foot, and then you can have an invisible zipper foot, and they're definitely very different. And if you're trying to do an invisible zipper, you don't want to attempt doing that with a normal foot. It won't go well.
I have, because my machine zipper foot is kind of like a wonky 3-pointed fork.
Oh, that's weird.
So it doesn't have all the different, here, let me dig it out. It doesn't have all the fancy gadgets on it that like other machines do. So I can kind of get around it at least. Yes, this is what my zipper foot looks like.
Oh, okay.
Actually,
So.
I have 2 more feet that are going to be important to talk about that I actually didn't think about before. Oh, see, that's a weird one. See, this is mine.
Yeah. See, yeah, that's what everyone, when I was all watching like videos when I was first sewing, and I was like, why is my foot so stupid looking?
Yeah, so like the difference between this foot and the invisible zipper foot is on the bottom of the invisible zipper when it has like flat, goes up, flat, goes up. So you have little channels that the zipper teeth can go through, which is why I can't use this because it's all flat. But since yours has those little like prong guys, like
Yeah, mine has a little prong, so it's basically like a 2-in-1 zipper foot. I've used it to do zippers, and then I've also figured out how to do invisible zippers pretty good on it. I don't think that it's the proper way to do that because I'm pretty certain that my machine has an invisible zipper foot. I just don't have it.
Well, what if it works?
If I needed it, so
that, and I'm sure like everything associated with your machine is very expensive. It's not like
because
a brother that's like, I'll work with whatever.
Yeah, no, mine's a FOF, so it's very specific about what it needs.
Then I'm sure you love these tools.
Oh,
and
yeah,
you probably have a lot to say about this guy.
It's my good old buttonhole maker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, it took me quite a while to be comfortable using this.
I always forget which direction it goes
It took a little
first.
bit of time, and then I was like, you know what? Screw it. I need this. We're figuring it out.
Right?
So,
No, I actually, whenever I hook mine up, I always have to do a test because I always do a test, but then I also have to do a test of my test because I need to remember which direction it goes first.
Mm-hmm. Well, because you're like, I need
for
to
the
make
life
sure I
of me
set
can't
it at the
remember.
right spot so that my buttonhole doesn't go over where it's not supposed to go. Yeah, okay, I'm really glad it's not just me that has to like double check what.
I was gonna say, what was it?
That and like sometimes adjusting it's weird because you'll put your little button here to try and get the right size, but then you'll be like, wait, this doesn't work well for this button size. I can hardly get it in and out.
Yeah.
So then you have to adjust more.
Huh.
So.
Oh,
Fun.
I thought I was thinking of rolled hems. Another
Oh.
this on always about the rolled hems. Another way to get an edge like this, just a sewing machine, is you can do a tight satin stitch along the edge. So I've done that on Alan's.
How do you do a satin stitch?
His entire tabard, the red outlining on it is all done with a satin stitch. So yeah, it's nice. But you have to really know your machine tension, and you kind of have to listen to your machine too, because since you're sewing half of it not on the fabric, like your needle will go here and then it will go back on the outside of the fabric, you really need to be listening to your machine, because if you start like hearing it making weird sounds, or like if the needle is like tinging off of something, you want to stop and like figure out what's going on, or reposition so that you're sewing a little bit closer to the edge rather than super far out. And then relying on like the bobbin thread to loop it closer back. You don't want to do that to the bobbin thread, because that's the most particular part of the machine. That's where the timing is, and you don't want to mess up your machine's timing. So if you're going to use a satin stitch as an edger, definitely do tests.
Right, because it's not just shortening your stitch length so that all your stitches are really close. The tension is very, very important. Absolutely. In order to get the right thing. Yeah. So.
I have a little like cheat sheet with my machine where everything like written down.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So that's what I do.
So one thing I wanted to bring up on this list, because there was like quite a bit in here, and I know, Kirsten, you've actually mentioned using bias tape quite a bit when we've talked about your cosplay builds, and there's like quite a bit in here specifically for bias tape. So, and Kirsten, actually, we were talking about this, Janelle, before you came on, so...
Well, so I just have examples. I'm letting her tackle bias tape. She loves her bias tape.
Other than rolled hems, the one thing that I talk about all the time is bias tape.
And I have the three levels of examples of bias tape.
I make my own bias tape, even though I have a bias tape making machine. There is no better time to make bias tape than 3 a.m.
However, I will say.
So I'm that kind of person. I love my bias tape.
Bias tape out of a spandex fabric.
Yikes on bias.
Better choices could have been made.
Oh yeah,
but
they could have.
It's not that like tin foily gold from Joann's. And it's actually the same spandex that I used on Galaxia. So we coordinate.
Nice. Yeah, but then the thing that I see, a lot of people do bias tape dirty.
Here's an early Kirsten example of the dirty. So I did one, and then I did the other, and you can see like the janky stitch line holding them together.
So like the thing about bias tape that
There's another one.
Looking for an example here. Do I have any pieces that I can just example with? Maybe. Here, I can show like 2 different fabric types. So say this is my corner, and I'm like, yay, I'd love to put bias tape on this corner. Wow, I'm in a mirror mode. So putting your bias tape along the edge like this, and then turning it and putting the rest of it over here, and then just like sewing it down and like all the way to the end and like looping it over. So there's like a weird, here, let me get another piece. So there's like the weird fold. The weird fold. Don't do this.
Yeah, this is bad. Don't do it. Okay.
The first time that I had a judge point it out to me, it literally changed my life. They said that the way that they described it to me was if you're aesthetically looking at the costume and your eyes are following the way the fabric is going and they're following the bias tape, and then suddenly it ends, or it gets like cut off by the vertical, or the horizontal like just gets sheared off by the other direction, it's really jarring, and it makes that piece of fabric like less meaningful to the costume. It almost draws attention to it rather than as the costume should. It's really weird, but
especially if it's a dramatic.
I liked that. Yes, especially if it's on a corner.
So this is because of how narrow this is, it'd be so distracting.
Mhm.
And even these corners, which these ones are just done like that.
Yeah. And then the other way that
Outside
some people do bias taping is, I know, like, you can top stitch bias tape, and yes, that's fine. It looks okay. I have thoughts and opinions about top stitching bias tape, but that's me,
So
that person.
you
So
see the diagonal, but it's folded. I can stitch a pencil under here. I top stitched it. I faked it. So it looks from a distance like I did it right, but if you look close, you can tell I did not do it right.
As we've talked
Yeah,
about for
so
contest, the 5-foot rule.
See, that wasn't a contest piece. That was a quick costume. So I was like, we're just gonna go for it. But it's also ribbon and not bias tape, but it's the same idea.
Mhm.
And then for your good example,
mitered corners. Yeah, mitering your corners is super important. There's a ton of tutorials out there on how to properly miter a corner. Also just kind of finagle one into place and then pin it and stitch it. So, and I do a lot of stitching of my mitered corners by hand because I'm very particular about how crisp they are and where lines are falling. Because sometimes if you sew them and then you flip them, because you do the mitering inside out and then you flip it to the outside, so it looks outside to outside, so it's nice. The line might not be pointing to the corner, so I always wind up kind of pushing it in one direction and like stitching it down so it's very straight, and I don't know, I like crisp lines. The one ways about if you're going to finish the bottom of your costume or a piece in bias tape, so say I want to finish the edge of this in bias tape, you can, you know, take your bias tape, it's double folded, and like slide it over kind of like a little like hat. So you can slide it over and you can top stitch the whole thing. A lot of people do that. You know, it's hard because you can't see the bottom, so you have to make sure that you've ironed really nicely, really good. Because if it's not ironed and it's laying kind of lumpy, when you sew it, you might not catch the backside, and you might have kind of some weird drunken stitching on the back, which is sad in the end. You don't want to rip it all out. The is called Stitch in the Ditch. I don't really care for this method because not a lot of people can do it correctly. A lot of people call it Stitch in the Ditch, and then it's actually just top stitching. So I don't know.
I don't like it.
There's a lot of feelings about Stitch in the Ditch and people doing it and calling it Stitch in the Ditch. But if you're going to do Stitch in the Ditch, what you'll do is you'll unfold your bias tape and you'll lay it. I wish I had a piece of bias tape. Why am I doing this?
Wait, I have bias tape.
Do you have a piece of bias tape that you can walk through? Because I don't have a piece laying around. I did when I was making masks.
I was going to say, if there was 2 cosplayers on the stream and didn't have any, I'd ask what the hell was wrong.
Right?
All right.
I'll just whip out my iron and like start making some. This is fun.
So I'll hold it how I believe you want me to, and you can narrate.
Yes, so you'll unfold it like how Kirsten did, and then what you'll do, you'll see that first fold line closest to the top edge of your fabric. You will sew in that line. And then once that's sewn, you'll flip the whole piece up and then over the other side, tucking
like
the
that,
edge bias tape.
and then this.
Yep. So it looks like it now has a little cap on the edge of the fabric. So it's pretty cool. It's clean and finished. But now what do you do with the other side? So a lot of people do this method called Stitch in the Ditch, where they will stitch so close to where...
Yeah, so it's basically like right
right there.
Where the fabric
stitch
meets.
along that. And they will catch the bottom side as a top stitch. So it will catch the bias tape on the bottom side, but it will be able to be seen, so it's called a top stitch on that side. But that's the method of Stitch in the Ditch. The method I use is once I've sewn in the ditch of that, or I guess like what I call the invisible stitch, because it gets folded under so you don't see it. Once I've done that, I always go to the back side and I stitch that by hand with an invisible ladder stitch. So, and that has been one of the techniques that has gotten me known in judging rooms. I'm the person who can sew, I can hand sew like as good as what would be the machine sewing the invisible stitch. That's practice. What I do is I just try to keep my, like, on, say I'm like sewing this piece to this piece. What I do is I try to keep my needle slightly, like I try to keep my needle only going through one layer of fabric at a time. So if it's like a lined piece, it doesn't go all the way through to the outside. I try to keep it as like, you know, neat as possible and hidden. So I'll kind of go slightly into the inside of the fabric just by like a tiny little bit. So I won't stitch directly on the edge of it, but I'll go slightly underneath. But my tension is keeping it tight. So that way then if like me, because I'm one of those judges, I'll go and I'll like test that tension. So I might like pull that back a little bit to see how loose that stitching is.
Oh.
I get like that, but like at higher levels you have to check hand stitching. Like
yeah, it's a big deal.
So and especially if they're coming in and they're very proud of their hand stitching, to me, I'm like, I like
You're
that.
like, oh really?
I love that they're proud of
the challenge.
I also want to test it. So the what I do is I'll go in and I'll just kind of, you know, run my finger along it, and if the fabric comes up, I'll be like, uh-oh, like that's really loose. That's not how that should be. But if I move this and I still can't see any stitching, they've done good. So that is one of the things that I personally really like about hand stitching is you can keep it really tight, really clean, because there's no sewing lines on it at all. It's all invisible.
So this, oh boy, this kills the color of this light blue.
It really
But
does.
Here, this is the outside, and you can tell it's the outside because you see the flossing design. Yeah, flossing. Corset flossing. But there is no stitching that you see.
Yep.
And then on the inside, like she was talking about, so because you can have more control over the tension of the fabric. So it doesn't really move
as
much.
you run your finger on it, it doesn't move. It's not like lifting up or anything. So yep.
And it looks way cleaner to hand stitch it, unlike like the
clean.
I did on the inside of it. I just did the stitch it down. So the bias tape, you can flip the edge of that up.
Yeah, see that's what I'm testing when I run my finger up too, is how close to the edge of the bias tape did they get with that stitch?
Well, yeah, and because so like the reason that sticks out on the back is how the bias tape is. So the underside is longer. So you see how one edge sticks out from the other? That's why you get that. So even if you sew right on the edge of this one, it won't be right on the edge of the underside. Now, if you make it yourself, you can get around that and have them be the exact same. But if you're using a store-bought bias tape, have fun.
Yeah. You also have to be careful too about how many layers you're stuffing inside of that bias tape, because even if the bottom of the bias tape you've made longer than the top, you're still folding all the way around all of that fabric. So you have to make sure that you're like gauging that distance to that added bulk.
So this actually reminded me of something I did not put on that list. What about sewing a very sturdy garment that is going to go under a lot of stress, i.e. a corset or some other things, you know, that are very tight fitting or have a lot going on. So, you know, they need to be strong. What advice do you have for that? And then maybe also when you're judging and you see this kind of stuff, what do you look for?
For me, specifically like with corsets and things, I always find myself adding little bits of back stitching in every so often on my my structure layers. So I will, along the I'll add extra little back stitchings, or I'll cut my thread and I'll tie it by hand too. I'll do like 3 knots by hand rather than back stitching with the machine, because sometimes if you back stitch, you don't quite catch all of the thread or enough of the thread every time you go, and also it can create kind of added bulk, especially if it's your fashion layer. It might not get covered by the bias tape or fanceries, so you know you want that clean look, so you might just need to pull your thread to the back side and hand like tie it. I did that with all of my applique on both ear because I could not back stitch on garment leather. Yeah, so every time I needed to end, I would turn it inside out and tie it like a quilt. It was wild. There's a lot of hand ties in there.
And actually, one other thing, since you mentioned, you know, seams pulling apart, especially something like a corset where this is going to be under a lot of stress going around you. One of the things that was mentioned, I forget where, but where you place your boning can actually help with that. So like
Yes.
this, my boning is not directly on the seam, it's next to the seam.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not pulling on that seam, it has things next to it that can help distribute the tension of the fabric, basically.
Yep. I've noticed that a lot of people with specifically like the very back of corsets will add in more boning channels closer together because it'll draw away from, because that's kind of where a lot of the tension for holding the corset together is going to be, is obviously the back where it's laced up and along the sides. But
The sides have a lot.
back, that if you start spacing them really closely, your boning channels, you mitigate to both of those seams. So it helps
to show
kind
that
of
like
alleviate the stress. Yes.
there's a lot of bones right
Boning
here on the
channels.
side of this.
Yes.
There's I think in all there's either 19 or 21 pieces of boning per half on this corset. It is very structured. It's a lot of spiral steel. And she's so sparkly. I mean,
she's beautiful.
So then what about the fabric choices for a structured fabric? Well, for a structured garment, how do you go about picking the right fabric?
So if you want a structured garment, if you can, make it out of more structured fabrics, like heavier weights, like twills, sports twills, denims, things like that. If you're doing like an inside layer on a corset using canvas, duck cloth, or like coutil, those all work. If you run into the problem of where you need a fashion fabric to become a structured fabric, you gotta line it with some interfacing. You have to help it out. So I made Alan 2 suits out of a very like flimsy fabric called Tencel. It's a linen twill mix.
Hi. Why would you do that to yourself?
Because that's who I am. Also, first tailored suit, yippee. So not only am I learning all of the techniques on tailoring a suit, not for myself even, so fitting it on somebody else. So learning men's suiting, because why not?
So you just basically did the the cosplay version of a Rubik's Cube at that point. So
Exactly. That's how every costume is to me. It is a Rubik's Cube. Which I don't know how I can do that. I get frustrated at Rubik's Cubes in like seconds because I'm like, you don't work.
Same.
And then people are always like, oh, well, there's the trick. If you just keep doing the move it this way and then this way, it will go back to normal. And you try that and it never works.
Isn't cosplay similar sometimes though?
Hey, you can make it work.
That's the thing.
So it's just like the Rubik's Cube of a costume is, well, focus piece by piece, and that's your one side of the Rubik's Cube, one side of the Rubik's Cube. But the thing is starting at the most inner piece and then going out.
Yes. So with this Tencel fabric, because it is a linen twill mix, it was white, so it was see-through. So I had to add, so every piece of linen twill had to be serged onto a piece of white cotton, just to make it opaque. And then each one of those pieces, depending on where it was, got to have a sturdy piece of interfacing attached to it. And then depending on where it was, it also had lining, and the lining had interfacing on it too, depending on where it was in the suit. So there was a lot of hand stitching happening. So much hand stitching. Nightmares of making little V's. So many little V's.
Yeah, so I've seen people do that for like tailored jackets, how they do the collar. If they don't want to put too much interfacing, but they want to help it sit a certain way, all the little V's that they put in that help make it so that, oh boy, I can't think of the right name for that kind of a collar, like that's on that green coat, so that the fold is in the right spot along the fabric.
Oh, yeah. And then it's also used mostly along like the kind of the breast pieces, leading up to the shoulder. That's where you'll use that technique for the most part.
What is the actual name of that technique?
I am absolutely spacing on it, and I'm very angry at myself. Let me do a Google.
To the Google.
And real quick while she does that, I forgot to say this on course that's also about distributing pad stitching. Thank you.
Pad stitching, yes. Gosh.
So like if
I've
you
only
have a
written in
certain
it in
spot,
like a ton of my progress books, so I'm based on the word.
So real quick before I forget, and I was reminded this because you can slightly see the twill tape. If there's one spot like the waist of a corset that has a lot of stress, twill tape can also help, even though this does have coutil in it, but it has that extra along the waist, because that is where the most stress would be on that.
That's something that a lot of people leave out on corsets, is the waist tape, the twill tape that's there. I've noticed that that's something that's almost that's been lost and is starting to finally come back, because people are realizing that is so important if you want to get like any sort of if you want any sort of shrinkage, you need to have the waist tape in. And like, even honestly, like some of my dresses, I'm adding in waist tapes to them because I feel that they don't hug my waist as good as they could because of the fabrics. And so I'm adding waist tapes into just the waistlines of dresses, because skirts are so heavy. So if I have a waist tape in, I can help it support a little bit.
That's a good idea.
So like, I'm doing that on my Sophie dress, because the first time I wore it, that skirt is heavy. It's such a big skirt. It's like a 3/4 circle skirt. It's massive. And the petticoat helps keep it up, but the rest of the dress, because it's one long zipper in the back, it's not getting the support at the mid back where like I S curve back in, and it's trying to pull away from me. So I'm putting in a waist tape to bring it in and hold it above the petticoat, which is kind of my ideal shape that I wanted with it. But Katsu crunch, you know, what are you gonna do?
It happens.
Sit at home for a year and not make costumes. That's what you're gonna do. Oh no.
Well, now it's going to be, because our Katsu 2021 is sadly not happening. We don't get to run around DC and be some nerds.
I am muy sad. My first days.
I was gonna say, hopefully, maybe in July you could come down for a Classic Game Fest. Hopefully that happens and everything's good. So there's always that. So you had a section in here about favorite tricks in. Somebody said pockets. Yeah, I kind of figured it was you, Kirsten. And especially because I know you don't always have, cosplay pockets, aka me or Luis, around with you.
Yeah. And then like later, it's like when you're wearing the costume, you've made it, it's beautiful. Then you're like, I don't have a purse or whatever.
Where do I put my phone?
I can't have like a backpack on and off because of this whatever on it. Like She-Ra, if I want to wear a backpack or a purse with that, I need to be careful of my little foam dudes that sit up like this. I can't.
See, this is why. Hear me out. This is why we need to bring fanny packs back.
Lauren loves, like the first time she wore her Frozen Fever Elsa, she has on a fanny pack with it. It's great.
Yeah.
Holographic. It was good enough for The Rock in the 90s. I mean, come on. And hopefully everybody knows the photo I'm referring to, so.
But yeah, so after cursing myself, past Kirsten, for not doing pockets and stuff, I've started to try and make sure I do put some kind of pockets. Unless it's something like Zelda, I'm actually probably just going to make a nice little purse that kind of matches it, because I feel like that'd work better for it. Mm-hmm. But then like Glinda, she's going to have pockets hidden under those petals. So, because why not take advantage of it? I could have them there. Briar Rose V2 has pockets. It's lovely. Mm-hmm. They're big enough to fit my phone easily without my phone falling out.
Which I had seen in person.
Whenever people talk about having like pockets in any sort of dress or anything, I always picture there's like a meme of like a vulture.
Yeah, I actually saw that earlier
like
today.
Girls when they say they got pockets, and it's like this vulture walking around because their arms are out. So like, they have them in like pockets on all of their like furry under feathers, and I'm just like, I love this.
That is
also,
great.
Newsflash, Peppy is helping right now.
Oh, the Peppy.
So that's what she's up to.
Peppy is holding the fabric down to make sure it's laced flat.
Helping Dadcat with his paper. What a foam smith.
And then if you want to start on the second thing on that list, I'm gonna grab something that shows it. It's down here. I know it is.
It was about understitching actually, so.
Yeah, understitching is super helpful. I found understitching to be most helpful along like necklines specifically, because it'll help the lining fabric from stopping from like puffing out and trying to take over the outer fabric. Keeps it in place.
So
Other spot where I have it is on Maximilian's cape, because velvet is like water and it doesn't want to do anything like it's supposed to. It wants to pillow out so bad. So I had to understitch it to keep it to the inside of the cape. So along that seam with all the embroidery, the tencel is on top, and that's what you're seeing. And there's very little peek out of red, like bright red. So
yeah, so my favorite example of the understitching I've done is this little bolero with some very evil curved sleeves. The sleeve is, oh boy, how many pieces?
it looks like insanity, is what it
There's
looks like.
12 pieces to one sleeve, not including the
that.
lining. And so because of this little, I don't know what to call this shape, but the curved shape here, the seam allowance didn't want to behave, and this is suede, so it really doesn't want to behave, because even if you iron the suede, it's flimsy.
Mhm.
So what I had to do to help control that is to understitch around this, and I actually did it all the way around this. So I was like, if I do a top stitch, it's gonna look kind of tacky on this piece. That doesn't make sense. So, and here's the neck of it. And
So
yeah,
that's
it
a
goes
way
all
to-
the way around.
That's a way to get around top stitching the whole thing, is by doing an understitch. And the way you'll do that is before you seal up the piece, you will fold the seam to the inside fabric and stitch it down and like hold it in place there. So that way then when you fold the piece right side out again,
So let's see.
iron it, you'll have a top stitching on the inside piece, which is holding all of your seam, your little seam hems, your seam allowances, up and into one side, rather than having them be held, I guess, by both sides, kind of like a sandwich effect with the thread. So they're only being sandwiched on one side, and then like your good fabric is just kind of hanging out doing its job.
Yeah, so like if this was your, I don't think I have any more pins. I only had one handy. But no, I have another one.
Hooray!
Because your pins should be hanging out near your 3D printer.
Always.
So say the cat fabric is your outer fabric. So what you would do is push that seam allowance towards your lining. In this case, that's Captain Marvel. And then you're gonna stitch that down. We're gonna iron it, we're gonna iron this, and then you have no stitching on the outside, but it's going to stay in place and not weirdly bulk up because you've stitched the seam allowance to the lining and ironed it nice and flat, and it will stay nice and flat.
Yep. And your lining won't try to peek out because it's sewn down to the seam. So it's not going to try to scoot up or, try to wiggle its way out. So
I brought this over earlier,
nice.
and I didn't put it on any of the lists, but I love this thing. It's a ruffle / gather foot.
Oh, I
yeah,
have one of those.
I've seen
It's still
video
in
of
the
that
box.
from you before.
Yeah, this saved me so much time on that stupid petticoat. All 56 yards that is cut down into 14 or 13-inch wide strips. It's a lot of fabric.
Wow.
Yeah, I think in all, when I did the math, it's like over 200 yards of whatever wide fabric. So if you were doing like the where you do a basting stitch and slide it, personally, I hate that method for gathering.
I really do too, but sometimes it's the only way to do it.
Well, the one I like doing is actually where you zigzag over like sock yarn. It's like well, not fishing wire, because you could do that. You basically usually zigzag over something.
Mm-hmm. I usually do,
and then you slide that. So yeah, what I have, it's like I said, I think it's meant for like some socks. It's not like the fluffy kind of yarn stuff. It's actually that pink thing right there. Mm-hmm. It's so it's thicker than this by a little bit.
Yeah.
But it really doesn't break on me, so that's why I like doing that. Mm-hmm. So and then
I switched over to using button thread for any type of hand gathering in like a long stretch, because button thread is chunky, so it's meant to hold.
I hate gathering by hand. It takes so
I really do too, but sometimes man.
But if you're in ruffle hell, one of these guys, once you've figured out the right settings, because it has two things, you can move this dial, which will basically ruffle it more, and then
Okay,
this
so it
one
makes
controls the width.
the ruffle length shorter.
Yeah. So I don't know if I have it in my sample. So basically, like, if you have it set small, this will maybe end up like 3 inches shorter. If you have it set to the max setting, you might end up with it like this.
A tiny little ghost.
Yeah, you'll have like an inch of fabric out of 15 inches.
Yeah.
So which for me, I was like, okay, I want to figure this out to get it so that I start with, say, 30 inches and I go to 15. I wanted to keep it a consistent, I half whatever it is, because you do petticoat math as in, okay, so my bottom tier is 8 yards. My next one will be 4, then one above that will be 2. Or if you have 16 on the bottom, that gets attached to the 8.
Yeah.
16 yards of fabric is a lot of fabric. And if you were gathering it another way to try and get it to 8 yards, no, this will save you time. But it can also do pleats. I haven't done that yet, but basically you adjust this guy over.
Oh.
Make it move. There we go. So I haven't played with that, but yeah, then it will basically, as far as I'm aware, make like knife pleats with how this guy moves.
Yep.
So, because this slides. It's a very noisy foot.
Yes.
When I used it, I was like, is my machine okay?
I have heard that they are really clunky sounding.
Yeah.
So I have a ruffle foot for my sewing machine that's been sitting in a box for probably 2-3 years at this point. I know, and it's funny because my mom picked it up from the sewing center back in like my hometown, and she learned how to use it on one of their machines in the shop, so that way then she could come and teach me. Hasn't taught me how to use it. So it's sort of sitting in a box. I mean, I could pull it out and learn how to use it myself, but I'm just kind of like, I haven't had to use it, but now I'm making my very first big old ball gown soon, so I figured out how to do that. Plus I gotta make an elliptical hoop, which is just gonna be a nightmare and a half.
Yeah, so I've heard some interesting things about elliptical hoops. As one, hoops in general, stitching the boning casing to your twill or gauze grain, however, whatever you do for your vertical lines, your fingers are gonna hurt. My fingers were so sore when I did mine.
Absolutely.
But the elliptical ones, I've actually seen some people talk about how, like, say you went with the truly Victorian pattern with their layout, that they actually went through and added more connections between the waist and the bag of it. If it's a very heavy petticoat going on it, like say a Cinderella. Yeah. Because of just how much fabric is going to be pushing down on that, and even the steel bones can have issues with that much on them. So you need more supports essentially going down and across, and so eventually I'll be there.
That's the hell I'm in.
I'm curious what ball gown it is you're making.
Brand Blue Fantasy. So.
Oh wow, nice.
Yeah. I'm excited.
One.
We have a huge Grand Blue group planned, and then Katsu got canceled, so now we're all like, so are we actually really doing this group, or was this just a pipe dream?
I was going to say, as an aside, I know we've actually talked about doing Grand Blue because, like Allie and I are fans of the anime.
We all like the anime.
Yeah, the anime.
Actually, I think Lauren is the only one that didn't watch it.
Well, Lauren's fucking up then. Okay, let's face.
I know, that's what I keep telling her, but she don't
okay?
listen to me. So
let's face some facts. So actually, real quick, there was one thing that's not on the list, but I wanted to throw out there because it's something I've been curious about. What were the techniques you attempted to learn, but it actually took you a while to finally have that moment where it's like, oh, hey, this is how it works. This is how I can do it. Basically, what was the ones that were difficult, and then you were finally able to overcome that hurdle.
Hand stitching bias tape so it looks immaculate.
Yeah, hand stitching can be a very
that is my claim.
Because if you don't have the tension right, as you said, you can flip up that fabric. Yep. Or if you pull too tight, you can break your thread. Yep. So it's a very fine balance.
Ooh, very important thing about that. So you don't break your thread. Sew knots every so often. It's just like in beadwork. So if you get to a certain point and your thread gets all tangled or you don't like how you sewed that section, you can just undo it, or you can just like cut your thread and start, with a new knot and a new thread and go. So you don't have to undo the whole piece. And as you're undoing it, stress that your thread is going to break as it's getting pulled back through the fabric. So, or like your seam ripper is going to like accidentally, get a little too sharp and like cut your thread, because we've all been there. But yeah, that is one thing. If you're hand stitching, tie knots pretty often. So
I think on my corset, the longest stitch length I did before like knotting was maybe like this much on that bias tape.
Yeah.
So it was not a very large
smart.
segment on this, so I had a whole bunch of segments. And then beading, I do even smaller ones, because if something comes undone, I don't want all of those beads flying off. Like, that's just like nightmare status.
Right.
Like, oh no, someone caught on my costume and the beads just went everywhere.
Wild insanity.
Oh.
I've seen it happen, so I definitely tie extra knots in everything that I do. So.
But yeah, as far as things that took a while, I'm thinking, because I'm trying to think of the thing that took the longest to pick up.
While you're thinking, so for me, the hand sewing one, I always respond with, it takes time and practice, because it genuinely does take time.
I bet, yeah.
Actually a build on and get better kind of thing. But like, I really want to host a, once we can be in person again and like see people and do panels, incredible. I would really like to host an in-person like workshop type thing. Just sit and hand sew bias tape, and I can teach people how to do this properly and like really empower them to, sew bias tape by hand more often.
Right.
More cleanly, because that is the one thing I see across the nation when I'm judging. It doesn't matter what state I'm in, what level people are in. I always see something with the bias tape that's done wrong that pulls points down rather than gives points to. And it's so disheartening. It's just like, you could have done this. You were the chosen one.
I was gonna say, who do we need to bug to get you guys down here so we can actually just have that damn panel? Okay.
Hey, man, I told them before, like, whenever I see for the like Central Texas, and even including like some of the Dallas cons where they make their posts of, oh, who do you want to come? I'm always like, Wig-Wig, bring Wig.
Because we can also run leatherworking panels, which Texas loves leather. So.
Yes, they do.
Can you make cowboy boots? That's a good question. Because if we could do that, if you build
so I thought of one thing that has a lot of carryover and shows up in a lot of the different things I sew, and I'm sure things in general. And that's like clipping your seam allowance properly. So if you want a corner like this to be nice and crisp and not like blunted, or you want your curves to be nice and smooth and not like chunky line segments.
That is so important.
And like, also, it's a thing that gets overlooked, but it's so important, and it can make a huge difference for how clean something is.
Agreed. And if you're going to be using bias tape, cut your bias, and making it yourself, cut your bias tape on the bias. Don't cut it on the grain. Don't be lazy. Don't hate
Unless it's a stretch.
Just do it.
This,
you want the stretch.
Cut on bias because it's a 4-way stretch metallic spandex. I hated ironing this, but I mean, it's fine. But the bias tape for this corset, because it is satin, it had to be cut on the bias. Otherwise, it would not fit the curves on here or on the bottom, because, I mean, it's pretty curvy.
Yeah, and the thing about it is, too, if you cut it on the bias, you're going to have an easier time doing mitered corners, and it's just going to sew more easily when you're also hand sewing it, because it will want to, it'll want to move in that shape rather than you fighting it and pulling it and stitching it into spots. So you won't get spots where your tension is really loose, and then your tension is really tight, and it kind of makes it a little wobbly. So if you cut along the bias, you're doing yourself a favor later on. You may seem like you're wasting fabric, but the way that you can make longer bias tape strips is you can sew them together and make long bias tape strips off of your cuts. So you'll have, of course, you'll have like little seams, but they're just like a diagonal line. And, you know, you sew them with a thread that matches. You don't ever see that, and you iron them nicely. It works out. So
Yeah, because if you don't do it on the bias, on like the underside of something, or sometimes even the outside, some people try to do like weird folds. Oh,
She's so helpful.
like
That is the worst blanket ever.
to make it go around a curve or a corner, people do like weird tucks
Yes.
and just stitch along it because it wasn't an actual bias tape.
Mhm.
It was a straight one, so it didn't work right.
Or I've noticed if people do where they top stitch their bias tape that's cut on the grain, they'll get puckers on the back where it'll like have folded over and they won't notice that because they're sewing it obviously by just seeing the top. So on the back side, it's pulling more fabric than what is being fed through, and it just makes for sadness.
That
And a
reminds
lot
me
of seam ripping.
that we didn't talk about. Like, say you're sewing with a fine fabric or even cotton. Depending on how you have your settings, you could get like puckers in your fabric, even if you had them like flat when you're sewing. And so some of that could be maybe you didn't iron your fabric ahead of time, and ironing is so important.
Ironing is so
This
important.
wasn't
Please
ironed,
iron.
it would look like a mess. It would not look smooth. See that side profile? Look at that. You want this.
So good.
But yeah, so sometimes you need to like test your fabric to see, is my length and tension settings proper so that I don't get weird puckers in this. And I'm sure you've seen it as a judge where seams like one side is like kind of puckery and the other side's not.
Yeah, a lot of that is definitely tension on the fabric and tension on the machine too. Especially like if you're doing long pieces of skirt and you can see like the back seam might look fine, but then the side seams, because of where like the fabric was cut when it was on like the large cut of fabric, if it was cut to grain or bias, your seam will get kind of wishy-washy, and that always makes me really sad.
Yeah, so that's again going back to the important to make sure you cut your fabric on grain. So like if this is my fabric, you want it most of the time parallel and go in the same direction. Because if you're working with like a velvet and you have the top of one piece here and then the piece that's going to line up with it, you have the top over here, the light is going to show that those are done different directions. One will look light and the other will look dark, because you, instead of sewing it like cutting it like this, you cut it like that, and then you sew.
Yep. Screaming on the inside because I have done this, and I was very, very upset with myself because it was like $120 of velvet down the drain, and I was like, I gotta buy more velvet. So don't do that to yourself. Also, if you're cutting velvet, please remember pile matters. So the direction in which you're cutting it, where the light is shining, and then direction matters. Remember to always flip your pieces. Because I did a real dumb during some of this, so you know, it happens to the best of us. But specifically with velvet, that pile where like you talk about lighting, that is so important to really pay attention to, because oh boy.
Like matte satin, you can get away with flipping it and having your pieces like that. But there's other ones where if you don't have them like this, you can tell because the light will make one look slightly darker than the other.
Exactly.
And then you're like, you didn't have everything going the same direction on the fabric. And then if it was cut off grain, or maybe you had it on grain, but a seam of it has bias to it, and you didn't let that stretch, that will show and you will get those puckers.
Yeah.
So it's small little things that might seem stupid, like the clipping seam allowances, that help a lot. Because I mean, if you didn't cut this right there, or do the two cuts where you do one like this and one like that, basically you try to cut as close as you can for this corner so there's not much fabric in it. It won't be a nice point. It will be like a rounded mush instead of a corner. And then
like, getting one of these thingums, a point turner. So if you're gonna do points, getting something that's sharp, I mean, it's not sharp, it's pointed but dull, so it doesn't stab through your fabric. It still can, because you're putting effort behind it to like shove it into the corner, but you can use a chopstick too. So, I just happen to have one of these This is like from my great grandmother. It's super old from Dritz. And
Yeah, sometimes I use
a magazine.
My paintbrush that I keep with my sewing machine because I dust out the bottom. Like, if my bobbin is doing something weird, the first thing I do is I will clean out the bobbin area.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if you have fuzz built up underneath that bobbin, it's going to bounce weirdly.
Yes.
And the bobbin case won't move properly.
Which can cause your needle to then go straight through the shuttle race, which I've done that twice. Not once, but twice. So my machine, whenever I take it in to be serviced, they're always like, you have holes on your shuttle race. And I'm like, yup. So
I might have a hole on mine.
The first time it happened, the guy who was repairing it, he was like, we could get you a new piece. And I'm like, well, is it necessary? And he's like, no, I can file it down and it'll work fine. So I was like, file it down. This is great. And the second time it happened, I was like, yeah, maybe we should get a new one. So, welcome, Peppy Cat.
So then, like, the curves, I tried to draw this. It's not too nice of a drawing. So you can have a smooth one or one that's segmented, so you have flat sections.
Oh, yeah.
And that's because you didn't do enough little snips so that it could do what it needs to do. Because what you want to do is lots of these little V dudes. Let me draw some of them in. So if you did, like, V-shaped snips, and you want to do V's because when it's
then the
not
fabric can fold.
Yeah, because then, like, those edges will, when it's on the inside, come together like this.
Mm-hmm.
And not be all bunchy, and that's why you'd get those weird line segments. And then, actually, since I drew this one, I should draw the corner one.
Look at you and your visuals.
I think we need to get you a whiteboard like what's her name on Rizuki's stream had the other day. We need to get you one of those.
Zoom has a whiteboard function.
Yeah, but I don't have
but
it set
basically,
up
what I was saying for a corner, now you're not going to go as close to this, but you'd want to do one snip going this way and one going that way. So you have minimal fabric right in that area. And then you'll get a nice corner that you can poke out, iron, and be happy.
It's so nice. It's so
like
good to have a sharp corner.
Oh yeah. And judges will love it. And just in general, your costume will look better if it's nice corners and all iron. Like, ironing,
Right?
please do it.
And if you can't iron something, steam it, please.
That's another thing, because, like, some fabrics you can't put an iron on top of. Maybe you'd have to use a pressing cloth. Like, if I want to iron this collar, I have to do a pressing cloth because of this metallic spandex.
Yeah.
I would burn it. Or maybe your fabric is very delicate. You could burn it if you just put an iron on it.
Mm-hmm.
Even
or
if you
like
have
velvet, where it has a pile. Because
Yeah,
put
you
an
could
iron
ruin
on
velvet.
pile, you basically flatten it down and burn it into place. So it becomes like rough short pile carpet.
Yeah, steaming is great, and like, I generally, for some of, like, the big skirts on, like, Zelda, or even short ones like Sailor Fuku's, I like to steam them because you want it to fall naturally. If you iron it, sometimes it won't, because it will have that crisp to it, and sometimes you do want that crisp, like the collar. But for this, you want it to be like fluffy magical girl status, that it can swoosh all over the place. So steaming would be better in that, but ironing would be best for the collar. So,
man, we've actually covered like quite a bit today, and but
and
when
this is just dipping
initially-
toes into the water of sewing.
Right?
What's that?
This is just like dipping your toes into the water.
Oh yeah,
You're
yeah,
not
exactly.
even, like, your whole foot's not in yet.
Well, and like when you and I were originally putting this idea together, I didn't really have an idea of how far it would go. It's just like, hey, look, this is something we should talk about. Bring somebody that we knew was very knowledgeable about the subject on,
Oh, thank
and
you.
then just but like I
And
said,
then a Google Doc was made, and then the Google Doc had a lot of things added.
yeah. So, but like I said,
Literally
that's
became a
great.
Google novel.
and when I was discussing this idea with Kirsten, and then we started looking at like what all the discussion was, it's like I want the truly the experts to drive this, and I know there's other people we could also bring on at some point and have their perspectives. So that's some, like I said, tip of the
especially like
iceberg.
if it's a group that judges, there is so much you guys see when it comes to sewing. Like, I've judged one thing for CGF, so I don't have as much of that. Like, I sew a lot and I see things, but I'm not exposed to as much or as much detail, because something can look nice from 5 feet, but not be nice.
Yes.
But that would be fun to have a group, like a larger group, to talk about that, especially in terms of competitions and, you know, the common mistakes they see that could be easily rectified, such as lack of iron.
Bias tape.
Not hand sewing your bias tape.
I mean,
not clipping your corners.
Not even not hand sewing your bias tape, just not treating it correctly. Like, doing some weird stitching on it. I've seen so much.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you can sew on full speed on your machine when it comes to bias tape.
Please don't.
But should you? If you do, your line's probably gonna be all.
We'll be drunk
and
in
your poor
stitching.
judges will cringe on the inside. And
I
just
cringe
be like,
sometimes on the outside. I go, oh no. No, I really don't. I'm very nice. But I always make sure too, if that person shows a lot of promise, but it's their bias tape that just like killed it, always go and find that person and I tell them the secret about bias tape, and I just hope that they've tried it, because that's the biggest goal, is to like spread the good word about our favorite bias tape.
So your bias tape panel needs to be the secrets of bias tape. That needs to be the official title.
The gospel
bias tapes, the secrets in the hold.
The gospel
Yes.
of bias tape. You're going around every Saturday knocking on everybody's doors. Like,
Knocking on
have you heard
doors.
about the?
Do you want to hear about my Lord and Savior bias tape?
It's me. Your neighborhood seamstress.
Yes.
So, but yeah, there's a lot we could definitely dive into, multiple aspects just based on the subject alone. And Kirsten, our stream idea list is going to get longer. Let's fucking face it at this point.
Yeah, well, because like of sewing, there's so much you can talk about. It's not just, oh yeah, one sewing thing and you cover it all. No, you could have so many different sewing streams and have very little overlap in between them.
Yeah. So, so one thing, Janelle, thanks so much for joining us. Because, like I said, you know, part of the reason we want to have you on here is because, like, we knew of your level of knowledge and we knew you could speak well to this topic. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And,
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
And we've been sharing your social media in the chat when the bot finally decided to fire off links finally.
Hey bot, wake up.
So, but you're also doing streams now as well, because you just you and your husband just recently started a Twitch channel, which is, I believe it is just also Wig-Wig Cosplay, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
We started our Twitch. We're not good about handling it yet. We're still kind of cleaning up from a location shoot that we did where we got some damage on the Huntsman that we're just like slowly I'm clicking away at some paint jobs that had just got like nicked, and I'm like, well, I should probably fix this. So
okay.
a bit of a disarray right now, but once we start, our goal is to sit down and actually write out a list of what projects we are going to be doing, and then nailing down what we need to order and what we need to start working on. And then once we have that, we'll probably try to get more of a like set in stone streaming, or at least like this is kind of when we want to do it and what day. So that may change, but
Okay. Yeah,
we're
'cause, like,
fly by the seat of your pants kind of people. So
yeah, like,
Which
'cause
means follow them on Instagram.
yeah,
do that.
She will post on her story whenever she thinks she's going to start streaming.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
I
definitely,
know I followed them
do
and I
that.
was like, yes.
yeah, I was gonna say definitely IG stories right now. I think for all of us, that's probably the best right now. The best way to keep track of when we're going to stream, because I believe only Twitch will only email once you actually go live. So
yeah,
there's
I
that
think it sends it out once you go live.
Yeah, so really right now IG stories is the best way to do it, because let's face it, hashtags are still fucked right now.
Yes, they are, and I hate it. Like,
All of us hate it right now. So
I have so many pictures to share and I can't because
I haven't shared anything from Briar Rose because of that. The same reason.
yeah, I've
so.
shared a few things. Like, I have another twirl video. Actually, I have a couple of different twirl videos because I like that skirt, because it's a circle skirt and it twirls so much.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, no,
although I did share a last picture of Robin Hood, and it did it as good as the other ones, around 150. So like that's kind of our average. Except for like one time my third fleet went onto Reddit and it went completely viral. And Reddit was a funny because I found it searching for photos for Third Fleet's winter coat, and I found myself on the internet, which is terrifying when it happens. But I have a morbid curiosity, so I went like after it, and I like read it down the thing, and I was like, "This is really weird." But like everyone was like, "Needs more feet," and so then I'm like, "Please don't, please don't." But then they were like, "Yeah, nice costume though," and I'm like, "Thanks." So I mean, overall, people were really nice, but they just wanted to see feet, and I was like, tasty.
There's an in joke with MTA, and I'm not going to say it on screen. So there's an in joke with that. So anyway, and Luis is probably just laughing his balls off right now because I said that.
I'm sure he is.
So for us, real quick, you might have noticed something a little different about the stream here. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner, we're actually now tracking follower count because we wanted to see if we can get to the 50 to meet one of the goals for affiliate. But on the flip side of that, we also do actually have a tip jar option that's available on our Twitch panels. And what we're trying to do is actually raise money so we can get Kirsten gear so she can actually do crafting streams. Janelle, kind of like what you're doing, like with having a separate webcam, to actually see what is being worked on. That's
well, like you can see me, but then see close up and in good detail what I'm doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I do a lot of hand work. Why not share it with you?
So that is definitely something we are trying to work towards for the stream, and also with that, if we can get to 50 followers and have crafting streams, maybe we can go affiliate and actually be able to offer more stuff. So, and we are working on some other things as well as far as, potential support for us. But with that, if you definitely like what we do, please give us a follow, set up your notifications, let you know when we go live. Follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, follow us on YouTube. It's Make Them Awesome literally everywhere. So makes it nice and easy that way. Good
and do all the same for Wig-Wig because they are amazing and they deserve the love.
Thank you.
Definitely. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, we don't have a day set yet, but we also want to do a similar thing, but all about armor.
Yeah.
So if you follow
you'll
us,
see the other half of Wig.
Yes.
Well, and you, because you do the painting, so we'll have
That's
we'll
true.
have
I
the
do the
wig,
painting.
not just a wig.
Just one wig. One.
The one wig.
So when we figure out what day and time we'll be doing that, we will post it on our different platforms, but the easiest one to see that on is probably going to be Instagram, especially on stories.
Yeah, definitely right now. So Janelle, like I said, thanks again so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Sharing your knowledge.
Thank you again for having me.
So,
I love it.
And there's definitely more stuff we'll have you on, because you're a good...
Trust me, the list is long.
Good.
It's not as long as the Book of Future Cosplays, which at this point is about to take over Cuba and give it back to the mob.
It's a very long CVS receipt.
Yes.
It's a very long CVS receipt. Is it a Joanne Black Friday receipt?
Well, it might be a couple of those.
Or Labor Day.
Because
Labor Day sales are better.
So it's not just one length, it's two. Because most of the time when I plan things, I plan in twos, not ones.
Same.
You know how it is.
I do.
Hey, Kirsten, what was the one meme I'd seen? Like, the distance from the Earth to the Sun is approximately 3 CVS receipts.
Okay, so a CVS receipt is what, 1/3 of an AU? Okay, we got this. We can do some math with this.
That's why I specifically mentioned you. So anyway, thanks everyone for joining us. We'll get this up to YouTube. It's probably going to be tomorrow. And, follow all of us on our social medias. And if you have questions about anything brought up in the stream, hit us up on IG and whatnot, and let's have some conversations. But most importantly, get dumb ideas, make them awesome. We'll see you next time.